So again, the subject sees the word tree, and if there's there might be a mask, but it is adjusted so that on that particular trial, they happen to become conscious of the word tree. The tree now here, we're going to represent it in our working memory box, right? And what dehaene and others, Bernard Bars and others, argue is that we can think of consciousness as involving this global workspace. He says, what we mean by being conscious of a certain piece of information is that it has reached a level of processing in the brain where it can be shared. Notice we have arrows going back. These would be long distance axons. And so the tree now has made it up to this system in such a way that now that information can be broadcast to other specialized processors in the brain, right? Here's another quote. What we subjectively experience as consciousness is the global availability of information, which allows it to be reported to us and to others. For example, some of the communication of the word tree, it involves the language system here. So the visual stimulus tree, the word tree, is up in our working memory, and now we can activate the sound of the word tree, and then the motor program to say the word tree. We can access the meaning of the word tree. We can try to remember the word tree, right? The hippocampal system is online here, can now remember that we saw the word tree. Maybe if the word tree disappears, we can maintain the image of the word tree in visual imagery by activating visual cortex, etc. We can maintain our attention to the word tree. So the global workspace idea is this suggestion that once a stimulus enters into this system, it is now capable of being shared. In other words, other systems have access to that, right? So this information here in the global workspace is available for other brain systems to do further processing. Now, once a stimulus enters the global workspace, then this communication with other areas of the brain sets up a kind of co-activation, correlated activity in these other areas. And we can think of this as in the following way. Once the stimulus has achieved consciousness, the cortical regions that process different aspects of the tree stimulus synchronize their activity, producing a single mental content. Now, he uses this idea of synchronizing activity, but remember, let's not confuse that with that synchrony that we saw in the research on sleep and anesthetic drugs. Recall that that kind of cortical synchrony abolishes consciousness. Dehaene's use of the word here means that once this information is being shared, other areas of the brain are being activated simultaneously, and all are processing the same information in their own unique ways. So the visual form of the word tree is activating a pattern of brain cells down here that would correspond to the sound of the word, but the visual form of the word tree is activating a different pattern of brain cells over in this region of cortex, which is accessing meaning, etc. But they're all processing the same information in a sense. It's all related to the thing that entered into consciousness. And so that's what he means by synchrony. And so then what you have then is this global broadcast of information sets up a mode of brain processing that is centered around this stimulus that is conscious. Now that ends up producing then this single mental content. If another word comes up on the screen that we consciously see, then the whole pattern of broadcasting will change. A new word will enter the working memory system and activate slightly different neural circuits in those same areas that corresponds to information about a different word. So for example, if the word boat is the next word that we're conscious of, well, now we're conscious of boat. We're no longer conscious of the word tree. We see the word boat, and so a different set of looping neural communications will be set up corresponding to the conscious awareness of a different word. Now let's just change the paradigm a little bit. Suppose we're instructed to simply reflect on a word that we see pop up on the computer screen. So let's say tree comes up here. And so that's a time one in our working memory system. So, right, all that kind of spreading activation has entered the word tree into our working memory system, this global workspace, right? Recall then that that information can be shared. Now let's focus on just the long-term memory store. So now we have a situation where the word tree may be activating different kinds of memories that are related to the tree. We might have an episodic memory, an autobiographical memory of climbing a favorite tree. Maybe we know some world knowledge that in the old days that when a cat would get stuck in a tree, the fire department would come out and rescue the cat. So maybe that kind of thought could be activated. Maybe we've got semantic information or other world knowledge that trees perform photosynthesis. And we can think of these different memories here as being engaged in a competition, right? So this stimulus here in our working memory being broadcast to our long-term memory system is going to be fishing for related memories. Well, it turns out that the autobiographical memory wins the competition, and that's then the next thing that enters our working memory. Well, what we consciously experience, though, is a word tree. We've got the goal in mind to reflect. That's what the experimental told us. But we see the word tree, and then the next thing that comes to mind is this recollection, right, of a memory involving climbing a tree. What we, again, we don't have introspective access to is this competition. What we may not sort of realize, right, it's beyond our consciousness, is that there might have been several different memories being activated here, but one of them wins that competition, and that's the one we experience as the next conscious thought. So for dehaene, we can ask a question, well, what is consciousness good for? And he makes the following points. Well, unconscious information fades quickly. We saw that in the experiments where you don't get that spreading activity. So there can be some activity happening in the visual cortex there, but it doesn't spread to the frontal cortex and parietal systems. Nevertheless, that unconscious information can still influence processes in the brain, and we'll see other research that lends support to that. What's consciousness good for? Well, conscious information can be held in working memory. Now, we might flip that around and say that which can be held in working memory can achieve consciousness. And see here again, dehaene and others are going to argue there's this overlap in our sort of these concepts of working memory and consciousness. And in fact, attention is also intimately related with these. What we're focusing attention on is more likely to enter working memory and achieve consciousness, right? So attention, consciousness, working memory are all very intimately related. As to the function of consciousness, and we might also suggest it's a function of the working memory system to provide an internal workspace to perform thought experiments, in a sense, while we can be detached from the external world. Here's a more extended quote from dehaene. The main function of consciousness is to provide an internal space where you can perform thought experiments, as it were, in an isolated way, detached from the external world. You can select a stimulus that comes from the outside world and then lock it into this internal global workspace. You may stop inputs from getting in and play with this mental representation in your mind for as long as you wish. So for dehaene, it is useful to have a system in the brain that can take the results of individualized processors in other parts of the brain, put them in a format where they can be shared to other parallel processors so that other useful work can be done. It's just that what we experience when that sharing is happening, when that broadcast is happening, we experience a conscious experience. Now that may leave some a little unsatisfied, because it still raises a profound puzzle. Why is it that just because a certain stimulus has made its way towards these frontal cortex circuits and then spread to the parietal cortex, why does that have this feel of being conscious? And whereas if the activity is restricted to the visual system, why that is not conscious? After all, it's all just neurons, right? There are neurons here in the visual cortex. There's neurons up here in the frontal cortex. They all kind of operate in the same principles, action potentials and squirting little neurotransmitters out of terminals. Why is it that this pattern of activity, this global pattern of broadcasting information, sharing it with other regions, why that is a very different type of thing? It's a conscious experience as opposed to all the unconscious processing going on at localized regions. That is still sort of intuitively deeply mysterious.